Honestly, I think if you are crying, you're emotional, you're triggering yourself to some degree, you're pouring your heart out so much that you have to actually stop and walk away from it for a while. I think those to me are all really good indicators that you're really kind of going deep. Because a lot of times, like if you're just able to sit and tell your story without having any type of emotional churning happening inside, you're probably not going deep enough.
Welcome to the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. There has never been a better time for writers. More information, options, and opportunities are available to you, but navigating these requires insight. Join Mark Leslie Lefebvre as he draws upon more than a quarter century of experience as a writer, a bookseller, and a trusted book industry consultant to explore and reflect on the writing and publishing landscape to help you make informed choices on your writer journey.
Hello, Reflectives, and welcome to episode 184 of the Stark Reflections podcast. This is your host, Mark Leslie Lefebvre. In today's episode, I have a fantastic interview with Jenn T. Grace. Jenn is a nationally recognized business strategist, speaker, and award-winning author. Guided by the mantra, change happens in business, Jenn believes social change happens first in the workplace before spilling over into mainstream society. She's been featured in Forbes, the Huffington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and CNBC. Passionate about helping people share their stories of adversity, Jenn is the founder of Publish Your Purpose Press, a publishing company that includes the PYP Academy with programs that teach aspiring authors how to publish their books. In addition to publishing 60-plus books that share the stories of others, Jenn has written 6 of her own. This is a fascinating interview, and we get into Publish Your Purpose Press. We get into memoirs very specifically, and it's a wonderful interview, and it's coming up later on in this episode. In the meantime, let's hear a word from this episode's sponsor, Findaway Voices. Findaway Voices is a platform that allows you to get your audiobook out into the market. 40-plus retail and library distribution platforms that you can make your work available. They're a great platform to work with, and there's always choice, always options with Findaway Voices. Now, for the ad read for today's episode, I'm going to share something from their blog. It's the Sweet 16 Audiobook Marketing Tactics. Now, they've paired up 8 awesome marketing tactic matchups in a free versus paid bracket, and they're asking for social media support on what works for you. They're asking authors, tell us your favorite tactics in each matchup on social media. What tactics do authors champion? And they're going to kind of rank those up and see how this kind of comes out in the fight. So just to give you an idea, and I'm going to have a link in the show notes to the Sweet 16 audiobook marketing tactics, but here's a high-level look at just the sort of what these are. So under free tactics, you have first in series free, step pricing in a series, ARC launch street team, email newsletter swaps, guest podcasts, guest blog tour, and weekly blog posts. And under the paid tactics category in this ring, we have BookBub ads, Google AdWords, professional refresh cover art, professionally written book blurb, Goodreads ads, Amazon ads, Facebook and Instagram ads. I think that's 8. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Did I? 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm missing one. I forgot to write it down, and I closed down my web browser. So you're going to have to go check out the show notes for the link to Sweet 16 audiobook marketing tactics. And I'm curious. Leave me a comment on the show notes at starkreflections.ca or at me on Twitter at Mark Leslie. Which of the free or paid tactics works best for you? I'd love to hear that. And I'm really curious to see what Findaway comes up with that. So if you're looking for ways that you can leverage your audiobook in the market, and you want to check out Findaway Voices and see how you can take advantage of their cool tools and systems and even the fun games like the Sweet 16 audiobook marketing tactics, you can check them out over at starkreflections.ca/Findaway. And that was an ad read from this episode's sponsor, Findaway Voices. Now, this episode is sponsored by Findaway Voices, which pays for the hosting fees for this podcast. But my time in producing this show is paid for by you, awesome patrons of the show, and I would like to welcome new patron to the show, Roland Denzel. Roland, welcome to the small but powerful group of patrons who support this podcast through donations of $1, $3, or $5 a month through patreon.com/starkreflections. In return for feeling awesome about supporting the podcast, patrons get access to additional content, including a reflections on other podcast feed, as well as additional bonus audio, video, and text content that I post to the patron-only spot. So I'm hoping that you patrons who support this podcast are enjoying the perks of the extra content. Thank you so much, all patrons, for listening to the show, but thank you, all listeners, for listening to the show. If you want to support the show, you do not have to throw money at me through Patreon. You can leave a review on the podcatcher of your choice, or better yet, share it with someone that you think would find value in my stark reflections. And so now, on to some personal updates. Yeah, I guess launching 2 books in 2 months on the 23rd of the last couple months has been busy times. So there's been lots going on. So on March 26th, I had a feature interview through my publicist, Mickey Mickelson, Creative Edge Publicity. I interviewed him a while back, many months back, and then I hired him right after interviewing him. He set me up with a feature interview with Jenn the Book Nerd, and it was all about fear and longing in Los Angeles. And it was this really great interview I did with Jenn, where I really got to kind of get into the nuggets of some details. So it was a wonderful interview, obviously promoting my new book, Fear and Longing in Los Angeles. On the March 31st, I was the guest host on episode 365 of the Sell More Book Show podcast. That's normally Brian Cohen and H. Claire Taylor. And Claire was off for the week, and I joined Brian as guest host. So we got to read through the news and some of the tips, which was a lot of fun. Always good times. And of course, I'm plugging my new book, Wide for the Wind. So of course there was that kind of was good timing for me. I was also on March 31st. I was a guest on with Laura Schoenfeld on the Inner Enlightenment Show Author Edition, and we just kind of talked about my writing journey in general. We obviously talked about my books for authors. We talked about my writing life. And it was a really fascinating. It was a 45-minute live chat. We did it. It was live to Facebook. There's going to be a YouTube video. There'll be a link to it in the show notes. And an interview I'd done last week, which went live today, April 1st, as I'm recording this. It was the Online for Authors Special Edition, Wide for the Wind featured guest interview with Mark Leslie Lefebvre, and Jenn, who is the host of Online for Authors, had me on, and that went live today. So that's been busy times. I do have some analysis I need to do on Canadian Werewolf in New York, which I did a price drop on March 11th. I had a BookBub for the 12th of March, and I want to go into the details. Now I got screwed on this because the price went back up to $4.99 everywhere, and I didn't notice till after the fact that Amazon in the US kept it at 99 cents because some stupid error in the Barnes & Noble system prevented the update from happening. And I never noticed it because it's only in the US, and I never really look at this US site because I can't shop there anyways. And so I had assumed everything was fine because I had everything scheduled to flip back on. And I was wondering, I actually looked at the details. I was only looking at unit sales for Canadian Werewolf and Stowaway and Fear and Longing in Los Angeles, and noticed, wait, I'm only making 35 cents on these sales. I should be making whatever, it's $4.99 or $3.72 or whatever I should be making on sale. Why am I making only 99 cents? But it's only on my US sales. So I emailed Amazon to say, what's up, dudes? Like, why are you at 99 cents? I changed it on the 20th. And they came back relatively quickly, I must add. Great customer service. And said, here it is. It's on Barnes & Noble. It's on 99 cents. We're price matching. I was like, oh, man. Like, seriously, for the 5 copies I sold on Barnes & Noble or whatever it was, I don't know how many I sold. I'm sure it was a couple more than that. But it was like, it really wasn't worth the hassle that they cost me because, I'm sure I wouldn't have sold as many units in the last couple of weeks. But, wow. I should have been making $3.72, and I was making 35 cents on those unit sales. And so that's really frustrating. But that being said, hopefully those people who got it for 99 cents liked it enough and will go on to buy Stowaway and Fear and Longing in Los Angeles, and maybe even pre-order Fright Night's Big City, which is the book coming out in December. So that's I'm gonna do some more analysis based on how that went. Now I'll hopefully do that in near future episode where I can kind of share this is how much I spent, this is how much I earned back, and therefore was it worth it? Which sites worked really, really well for me, because I did a bunch of promo stacking. But that being said, other personal update is tomorrow on Friday. I guess it would be Good Friday here in Canada, which would be April 2nd. And I know it's not just in Canada, but I've got a story stuck consult with Clark Chamberlain. And Clark's a brilliant guy. I met him through probably through Johnny, Sean, and Dave of the Smarter Artist Summit in Austin years ago. And Clark is a genius. I've seen him in action, and I've been in a mastermind group with him for a while. He's a wonderful guy. Love his insights that he shares every week in the mastermind. And so I've hired him for a story stock consult. And what this is I'm going to be going over some details related to the next novel, Fright Nights in Big City, because all I know is this high-level story arc and how it's going to end, which I've had in mind the whole time. What I'm having some issues with, I'm having some trouble with, or I have all these different options for different things that happen throughout, and I want to feel him out for that. So I've sent him the details of the previous books, what's going on, sort of the high-level character. And I'm really looking forward to this, because just from talking to authors that have worked with Clark on story stock consults, it's really, really great, because he really takes a solid storytelling approach to help you figure those things out. So that'll be, doing that with Clark is going to be a phenomenal opportunity for me. And then, of course, I go back to Joshua Esso, who's been my developmental editor. And I would normally do something like that with Joshua, but I know his schedule is a little bit tight right now. So I just want to kind of get through this hump. And I know Clark's going to be awesome for that. And then, Joshua's been sort of my regular editor throughout. So I think the thing I'm learning is it's okay to work with different professionals, because I'm going to be getting a different sort of thing from Clark in this consult that I think is going to bring me some fresh insight. And then when I go to Joshua's been with the series from the beginning, knows the characters intimately. And when we're working on some things, he's going to be playing with me at a different level. And so I think as a writer, I can become much more proficient and much better at what I'm doing by working with multiple professionals. Different types of editors, different types of story consultation. So I just think that's an important thing that I continue to learn as I move forward as an author. And I thought I'd share that in case that's useful for you and for your journey. But that's it for the personal update. Why don't we get right on to the right on? I always say right on, and I was like, Mark, you're 13, 14 minutes in. What the heck? That's not right on. But hey, what are you going to do? Why don't we get on to this fascinating conversation with Jenn T. Grace. Hey, Jenn, welcome to the Stark Reflections podcast.
Thanks for having me, Mark. Great. I'm happy to be here.
So let's get into I want to talk a little bit about your reading life and your writing life. How did you get involved in all these creative endeavors?
Oh, good question. So if I go back in time to earliest memories, one of the things that I always wanted to be was a Dear Abby writer. So, and I don't really know where that came from. I always wanted to be a writer, even in high school.
Supportive writer at that, right?
Say that again?
You said a Dear Abby writer?
Yeah.
You wanted not just to write, but to help people. Yes,
exactly. I wanted to have like an advice column about, who knows what I was thinking as like a 12-year-old, I'm not sure. But, for a while, then I was like, oh, what type of job could I get into that was writing related? And for a while, I wanted to do technical writing. So that was kind of like throughout a little bit of high school, I thought maybe I would go into technical writing. And I ended up not doing either of those things, leaving high school into college. And I ended up getting a degree in communications, which required, a lot of different types of styles of writing and things like that. And then My Dear Abby dream, if you will, quasi came through. In 2012, I started writing a blog that was very much an advice column. And then that led into publishing books around that advice. And then it just kind of spiraled from there.
So was your advice like Dear Abby on this blog, was it anything anyone wanted, or was there very specific lanes you stayed within?
Yeah, it was very specific lane. So I was doing LGBTQ inclusion consulting work.
Okay.
And so through that work, I would have people ask me very random questions because I was just kind of putting myself out there and saying like, hey, ask me what's on your mind. Like if you have this question, chances are there's 100 other people at least that have the same question. And so the more I kind of put myself out there, the more people would ask random things. I'm like, you know what, this is a learning opportunity. So maybe this weird thing happened to me. Someone asked something they shouldn't have asked, or whatever the situation might have been. And so I just started answering it in a very non-judgmental fashion. So that way people could kind of learn from the mistakes of others. And it just really started organically grow from there. And it was just rewarding because I could kind of write about my life experiences, but also provide advice for people to not get caught in those same situations.
So that leads to something that I read in your bio that I'm really fascinated by. I'm gonna quote from it because I think it's very pertinent. Jenn passionately believes the more raw and real we can be, the deeper the connections we can experience. This drives her fierce commitment to bring voices to the invisible stories that free people from their isolation. Now, there's a lot to unpack in that single paragraph. I want to talk about raw and real. So the blog itself was you being raw and real, and then people asking raw and real questions?
Yeah. And I think it to me, it's tricky to get people to be to that level of vulnerability that kind of starts to break through the noise and clutter, because I think so often, whether it's in conversations or in books, we're very surface level. We're very, we don't want to go deep with somebody because maybe there isn't that level of intimacy or trust or whatever it might be. And so, yeah, I really believe that the more raw and the more real we are as the writer or author, the more we can create that safe environment and container for a reader to also feel that and for them to kind of reciprocate.
So, see, that's interesting because you're getting down to the fundamental reason why we're storytellers, right? Is that human connection. It's really what it is. I have a story to share, whether it's fiction, nonfiction, whatever. I'm telling you something, and you're going to emotionally respond to what I'm telling you, or not. Actually, if you emotionally respond, there's success, I think, maybe. And if there's no reaction, then it's kind of like dead fish, kind of whatever, or whatever sort of blank slate sort of thing that's happening. Is that the kind of raw that you're talking about, like either in fiction or in even obviously when you're actually exposing yourself, like your personal stuff?
Yeah, my wheelhouse is in nonfiction and memoir, not necessarily in fiction. And I think, with a memoir, in my experience anyway, I feel like there's so many ways that you can take a shortcut, even in writing your own story. And I think those are the memoirs that are not the ones that are gaining any type of accolades or any recognition or really have sales, honestly. And I think it's because readers can tell when somebody's just doing it halfway and they're not putting their whole heart into telling their story. And so, and I think that also goes, obviously, to me, that's a given for a memoir, right? Like if you really want to really get to the core of what your story is and allow the readers in for that very intimate experience, that to me is how that should be done in kind of like a given parameter. But on the other side of it, nonfiction, I think so often authors don't include their story enough into their nonfiction work. And I think that's a real opportunity to be that raw, real and vulnerable human, because then you're really going to connect with your readers in a way that people somewhat don't expect from reading a nonfiction book.
So I want to get down into this because I'm really curious. So before the work gets sent to an editor, before the work is out there for the world, whether it's a blog, whether it's with a publisher, whether it's indie published, are there indications that a writer may have when they're in the act of writing, the process of actually bleeding onto the page or whatever it is that they're doing? Are there indications that a writer knows that they're being authentic in that communication to the page? Are there things that they could kind of look for?
Yeah, that's a great question. Honestly, I think if you are crying, you're emotional, you're triggering yourself to some degree. You're pouring your heart out so much that you have to actually stop and walk away from it for a while. I think those to me are all really good indicators that you're really kind of going deep. Because a lot of times, like if you're just able to sit and tell your story without having any type of emotional churning happening inside, you're probably not going deep enough.
Wow. Now, you released a memoir in September of 2020 called House on Fire. What was that experience like for you as a writer? And then I'm curious, obviously, to see what the experience of the reaction was.
Yeah, what's interesting is that I have coached so many writers through the nonfiction and memoir process, so many. And I had already written 5 nonfiction books. So to me, that's, I have a formula, I know what I'm doing. Memoir, it's just been very gut, very instinctual. And actually going through the process myself, which was partly I needed to tell my story because I myself had to free myself from that isolating feeling. Like I feel like I had no choice but to actually share my story. But in the same vein, so much of the reason why I was doing it was so I could actually experience it from that first person perspective of all of the people that I've worked with. And it was a really, really intense process. And where it was most intense is actually not the writing of it on the page. I had a friend of mine really kind of help me through that process because as we all know from writing, it can be very isolating. It's a very siloed journey. And I like to think about writing and publishing, generally speaking, as a team sport. So, get a good bench of people that can support you in whatever way. It might be emotional, but might be the actual writing. But what I found to be most surreal was actually the audiobook. So I outsourced that function. I'm like, I am not going to narrate my own audiobook, even though I have 3 podcasts.
Like memoir.
I know. I get it. because I'm so, I don't want to say judgmental, but I 100% have preferential treatment to listen to memoirs that are narrated by the author, 100%.
Right.
But when I was actually thinking about, could I reasonably get through reading my own story myself? And every time, every editing pass, every proof, all the passes, there were a couple of different spots where I would just be super emotional and I could barely finish the editing of what I was supposed to be doing. So I realized, I'm not the right person to narrate my own book, and I have to be okay with that.
Right.
And what happened is that when I was listening to the chapters as they were coming back from the narrator, and then once I listened to it in its totality and was just kind of listening and looking at the book to make sure nothing was missed, I was a weeping disaster. I cried from start to finish of my own book because it was the first time in my life I was able to objectively hear my own story because it was being told in someone else's, by somebody else.
Oh, that kind of separated you from that a little bit.
It was such a surreal experience, but I also think, number one, it saves years of therapy. And number two, everybody should go through that experience. It was really profound.
Are you able to share what your memoir was about, even at a high level? I don't want to dig into the weeds too much, but I'm sure people are curious, like, oh my God, what was this?
Yeah, the way that I would summarize it, because there's so many intricacies, is that it's the first third is being adopted, the second third is about adopting, and the third part is about giving up a child for adoption. So it kind of covers 3 very different landscapes.
Oh my God.
And it's a very intense read. I'm not going to lie. I feel like
Wow.
I hear people reach out to me often to say, I couldn't put it down and I cried through most of it. And,
Wow.
which again, I had to practice what I preach. I had to go really raw and really deep. And every time an author that I work with says, hey, I read your memoir, I kind of cringe a little because now I know they know me on such an intimate level that feels very uncomfortable. But I feel like that was intentional, even though it still makes me uncomfortable.
Wow. It's funny when you say that. I was adopted, so I have one of those experiences. I had friends who have given up children for adoption, and then other friends who have adopted as well. So it's kind of like there's so many points of connection. Even and not having read, well, now I've got to put that on my TBR pile. Although it'll probably be a TBL because I'm a slow reader, so I'll probably it's available in most places, I imagine.
Absolutely. Yep.
Awesome.
Yep.
So I love that you were able to, through the professional narrator that you hired to do the work, that actually allowed you to look at your work in a way that writers rarely get a chance.
Yeah.
Um, can you explain to people who are thinking of memoir, because you talked about it as being a really good therapy, which
Hmm.
can be amazing. A memoir isn't just a blow by blow, this is my life, right? Like how would you define a memoir?
And I think that most people confuse autobiographies with memoirs. And so an autobiography to me is really that volume of work that is the entirety of your life.
Right.
Whereas a memoir is a snapshot in time.
Okay.
So with mine, I chose age 6 to 36. So my entire memoir, all of the stories fit between those ages. And there are plenty of other memoirs out there that maybe they're just capturing, their time during their service in the military. And that alone can be a memoir unto itself. Or maybe it's just childhood, or maybe it's a divorce. And, who I aspire to be in my life and look up to so much is Dani Shapiro. I think she is one of the most brilliant memoirists that we have. So because she does it so well, because it's always just that singular snapshot in time, and she weaves them all together so beautifully and I wish more people kind of really understood what a memoir was, because a lot of times they're cramming in all kinds of details that just slow down the pace of the entire read, and then it's not enjoyable for the reader.
It sounds to me like that's incredible advice that writers need to heed, because it's kind of like I've been working on my memoir for 20 years and I keep forgetting stuff, and Addie is like, no, it's not your life story.
Yeah.
It's this very specific, right? In your particular case, adoption was the centralized theme, right?
Yep.
Okay, I really like that. So you've coached other authors on writing specifically memoirs?
Uh, Both. I look at myself more so as more of like an author coach, which you would think is the same as a writing coach, but I don't, I feel like I'm a good writer myself. I have a very specific style of writing. So any book that I've written, you can pick up and you can hear me speaking. Like, it's very, very conversational, very intentionally, but I'm not the grammar police. I am not in terms of the writing craft itself. But what I do help authors with is really strategically thinking about how they're telling their story, what they're going to include, what they might not include, and how is that going to strategically align to maybe their business goals. Because we work, myself and my company, we work specifically with authors that are growing their thought leadership platforms. And to effectively do that, you have to be really strategic about what you're going to share, how you're going to share it, and how you're going to really hook in that reader to be so captivated by what you're saying that they want to sign up for your newsletter, attend a webinar, get a workbook, whatever else it might be. So it's, similar, but not quite the same.
So let's talk a bit about Publish Your Purpose Press and the support that you offer to authors. At what point should an author, or would an author be looking to say, hey, I need to work with a company like this, or a team like this?
Yeah, it's kind of everything and then not everything. So where we really shine is when we have an author who comes to this where they have their first draft. And it's, my editors always say, like, have the author bring their best and final version. That, as we both know, is never actually what makes it out to the market. But, it's their best, is what are they able to do? And then our job is to elevate and amplify it as much as humanly possible. So that's when we really, I think, are in our sweet spot. However, we do work with a lot of people. We have different kind of online programs and products available that can help people really just even in the early ideation phases of the writing process. So we have a program that's called Getting Started for Authors. And it's exactly what it says it is. It's about getting started, because in my experience, the barrier to entry to get that book published is really just not having the wherewithal to know how to organize yourself, how to find the right accountability, how to get into the right mindset, and then having some writing techniques. And so, once someone has that point to get started, then it's just a momentum, then it's just a matter of kind of consistently coming back to it day after day, or whatever your writing schedule is. And so, in those cases, I love helping people in that regard, because for me, it doesn't necessarily matter how someone is published, who they work with, what company they go through. To me, it's the bigger purpose of getting people's stories out there that are going to change other people's lives.
Oh, I love that. So I want to go back to back to the author and looking at that kind of thing. I love how you're open. You're not worried about process specifically or grammar, syntax. I mean, that's an editor's job anyways, but
Yeah.
you're worried about helping, well, helping them publish their purpose, obviously. Very, very good terminology for the naming, but basically you're helping. Is it probing? Is it asking specific questions to really get to the root of what their real goal is? Because you talked about surface and then
Mhm.
depth, and does that come into play here too?
It absolutely does. And it comes into play in a couple of different spots in the process. So to me, it even comes up in just that first initial call that I'm having with somebody. Like that's how I lead the conversation is tell me about the high level of what you're trying to do. And then from there, I can kind of unpack and unravel and figure out what's going to be the next, best course of action for people. And what's interesting is that I will always say this and will continue to say this is that I will talk to any aspiring author. It doesn't have to be, as long as it's within nonfiction or memoir. Fiction writing, that is not my wheelhouse in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
But if it's somebody who's trying to do good in the world and they just need that little kick in the right direction, I will happily have a conversation. And so often I talk to people. I actually had a conversation right before this, and I talked to him. He's like, "You have educated me so much on all of this process that I could just take what you gave me from this conversation, go do it, and never talk to you again." I'm like, that's exactly my point. Because the people that need my help and need my team support, we're there for them. But there are a lot of people that have the right wherewithal, the bandwidth to go off and do it. They just need that calibration to their North Star. Because I think a lot of times, we're looking for true north, but we're off by 10 degrees or by 15 degrees. It's not a 180. It's just ever so slightly off in the wrong direction. And you just need that outside eye to be like, hey, what about this? And then it's just kind of that aha light bulb moment for people.
Well, it's funny to follow that analogy. If you're only off like a quarter of a degree, if you're far from the North Star, the further you travel, that little tiny percentage is going to grow and grow and grow. So it's this course correction that you're helping, right? That sort of
Yep.
biofeedback maybe to keep
Yeah.
them centered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's my role in this process is really kind of recalibrating at even in that very first conversation, whether someone's working with us or not. Then to me, it's passing that baton to the editorial team for them to be reminded constantly, like, this is the North Star for this project. Make sure that everything that you are touching and doing is driving us back to that direction. And it's, to me, I think hiring editors can be tricky for people because a lot of people don't really know the different types of editing that are available, and they kind of do things out of order sometimes. And so we have a really kind of tight process with that, just to make
Right.
sure that I'm communicating internally to make sure that they're going to communicate with the author the best they can. So that way, when the author comes back to me in the process again, everything has been in complete alignment, because I think it's really easy to get disconnected and disjointed throughout just the whole process.
Wow, that is really cool. So you specifically specialize in helping with a nonfiction memoir.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've encountered this, and I'm curious to your take on fiction memoirs or memoirs or fiction that have memoirs embedded in them, like all of the different intricacies that are associated.
Yeah.
That must be something that comes your way regularly, right?
It absolutely does. And one of the tips that I tell writers all the time when they're kind of really in that early phase is if what it takes to help you get your memoir across the finish line is for you to write it as a piece of fiction and to put a
Right.
pen name on it that is not your own, then do that.
Right.
Because sometimes we are and I actually did this for myself. I had a whole pen name picked out. It was going to be Grace Remington. I thought it would be like a nice regal sounding, great pen name. And so I was like, so when I was writing my memoir, because I was thinking I had a lot of doubts or a lot of concerns about the repercussions of being so raw and so exposing. But I will say, on a side note, I have had nothing but love and warmth from friends and family alike. And I really thought I was going to upset a multitude of family members, and that didn't happen. So I'm very grateful for that. But I had to write it for me to be able to get it out there. And it's one of those things that I tell people, I'm like, you know what? You can just start the process with the pen name, because that is a decision that you can change at the absolute last minute of this entire process.
Right.
So if that's what mentally gets you into the right space to get your story out there, then go for it. And so, I do end up having people that, they kind of hem and haw. They're like, oh, maybe I'll put it out as fiction. I'm like, then put it out as fiction. It's still going to be your story. To me, where I get tripped up is the marketing of it, because I know how to market a nonfiction book. I know how to market a memoir. I have no idea how to market fiction. That is a whole kind of area unto itself. So that's when I'm like, all right, I can help you to a point. And then when it comes to the marketing, you're going to have to find somebody who like really understands this space specifically.
Wow. I want to get back to this because it reminds me so much of your own experience with the audiobook, right? That layer, the narrator allowed you to approach it from outside yourself,
Yeah.
your own perspective. And maybe that fiction is a way for somebody who's having trouble because it's too emotional, because it's too difficult, that fiction allows them the ability, maybe the freedom. It's like, oh, it's not me. It's not me. It's not my story. It's this fictional character's story. Therefore, I can now approach it from that third party viewpoint and get it out there. So that it almost sounds like that's a really critical tool in some cases.
Yeah, and I think one of the big reasons for it is I talked to a woman recently who is in a witness protection program due to a very serious domestic violence situation that led to some deaths around them. And for her, I was like, just write it as fiction. And she has a passion around writing anyway, so that actually lends very well. And I was saying to her, I'm like, you can fictionalize any piece of this that you want. So if you don't want to go into gruesome detail about the circumstances of what happened, you don't have to. You can change how people died if you want to. You can change the characteristics of the person who is your abuser. There's so many things that you have this creative freedom to change that narrative entirely, but also still get the catharsis of putting it out there at the same time. And that's the beauty of fiction, whereas in obviously memoir, you can't do any of that.
Right. So that leads to a question about memoir itself, because when you write a memoir, especially when it's raw, especially when it allows you to be vulnerable, there's an element of the people in your lives also inadvertently become vulnerable. So what are the recommendations that you've usually make? So I'm going to talk about like an abusive relationship and how I escaped from it. How do I talk about the abuser, and do I reveal who the abuser is? I mean, those kinds of things, or a parent that maybe had issues with drugs and alcohol or whatever, and this is a pertinent part of my story. How do I do that without embarrassing, hurting, people, loved ones or family and friends?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think a really serious question too, because there's also legal ramifications that can kind of come into this too, depending on how exposing you're being of those around you. So what the way I would look at it is kind of in layers. So instead of thinking, because this is where I find writers get tripped up and authors get tripped up, is that first step is to just write your story. Do not worry about changing details, names, anything like that. Just worry about getting your story down on paper. Then as it's going through the editing process, because and I'm sure in your experience too, sometimes there's like chapters, entire giant sections that are then missing that you don't have to worry about, editing. So I usually wait until you've gone through kind of that developmental edit. You've had that first editor kind of look at what's there, what's actually going to stay, what's going to go. Then I tell authors to go through that second pass. And now that's the opportunity to change identifying details about specific characters. In some cases, it's really difficult because if you're writing about your parent, there's no way around that. Like, that's your parent and anyone can find that information publicly. But in many other instances, it's a matter of not telling everything. And that again goes back to one of the earlier points of you don't have to include every single story. So, I think about in writing my memoir, both of my parents are no longer with us. So I didn't have to worry about what I would or wouldn't say about either of them. Had my mother in particular still been alive, I may have either chosen a different way to do it, or I might have waited until she was no longer around. So, those are things that you have to take into consideration. But I work with authors who they don't care. So I have a woman I'm working with right now, and she is just laying out all of the family drama and she's unapologetic about it. And she is fully aware of the repercussions that could come as a result of doing this, and she's okay with those. So I think if you're okay with whatever the consequences might be, and you're going to proceed forward anyway, that makes sense. But you don't want to blindly walk into something where you think that you're doing this good thing for yourself and kind of freeing yourself from trauma or baggage or whatever it might be. And then inadvertently end up getting, someone trying to sue you over it. So, and the other thing I would say about this is changing names. So I waited until the very, very end to change all of the names, because it turns into chaos. Because even now you could say, hey, I read your book, tell me more about Elizabeth. And I'd have to be like, okay, who was Elizabeth? Like, and then rattle through, like, oh, that's who Elizabeth is. And it still happens today, because somebody will say something. I'm like, all right, hang on, give me a minute to figure out who you're talking about. And then they'll throw out a few details. I'm like, that's who it was. So, but that's great, because if you can't identify who you're writing about, then no one's going to be able to identify them. And that's kind of the point. But you want to do it at the end so you don't muddy it. Because if I were trying to edit through the process of different names, it would have been so painful.
Yeah, because it almost feels like if the person's real name was Sue, for example, and then you tried to write them as Elizabeth, you'd have to have a map of the names that you've replaced with. So Sue equals Elizabeth. Yeah, so you do it raw, unabridged. No one's reading the manuscript but you, and then you can do the find and replace or whatever it is that.
And put it in a spreadsheet, which we have spreadsheets that we track. Like, this is their original name. This is what we changed it to, and if there's very specific identifying details. So, we had a memoir that we published that was around serving openly gay in the military under Don't Ask, Don't Tell in the United States. Right. And for him, we kept his branch of the military the same, because that was very important, because he's obviously proud Air Force person. But there were so many other connection points in that story with different branches of the military that we had to change the branch of the military, the gender of the person, sometimes their ranking as officers. So that way there would be no easy way to be like, oh, he's talking about her. So
or specific times and dates, right? Maybe location A is really going to be location B, which is fictional.
Exactly. And those are all, they're all minor details in the grand picture, because they're just those character points for somebody to be like, okay, I have a good idea of who this person is. But at the end of the day, where it actually happened or the gender of the person, most of the time, gender is probably a bad example, but most of the time is less relevant to the overarching story of what you're trying to tell.
Yeah, it's funny. I do true ghost story books with a traditional publisher, and there are times when somebody does not want their identity to be revealed, because in some cases a medical professional, and it's about a haunted hospital, and they don't want it to get back to them. So you either fictionalize where the place is, or you change their identity or their role. They're a surgeon or a nurse, but you change the role into something else because it's not important what they do.
Yep.
Yeah, I see that.
But just don't make it obvious. I'll just throw that out there too. Just don't make it obvious. So one of the things that I screwed up is that in the beginning part of it, is that I was changing people's names to be ever so slightly different than what their actual names are. And I'm like, well, that was dumb. And so then I went to the extreme. So I'm like, if your name begins with an A, now it begins with a V. Before it was like begins with an A, it's staying with an A. And it's like, well, that just makes it like way too hitting close to home to the people that you're actually writing about. And you're writing it for you, not, you should be anyway, writing it for yourself and what can the reader experience from your story, not as a vindictive, I'm going to tarnish this person through the mud. And a lot of people do, unfortunately start memoirs with that in mind. And that's certainly not somebody that I would work with.
Right. Well, it almost sounds like, and there was a conversation between Jenn and Marcel. It's like, I wonder who these two people were.
Right.
So let's go back to, you talked about that memoir from 2020, but you have 5 or 6 other books that you've published?
5
memoirs, or what were they?
No, the first 3 I wrote they were based off of the blog that I was mentioning before, my Dear Abby-ish phase of LGBTQ inclusion, which is really around just basic respect, like how to respect your coworkers, your colleagues, employees, employers, situations. And then the 4th book that I put out it's called Therapy Notes for Families. And it's more of a workbook, and it's intentionally 5.5 by 8.5. So you can just shove it in a bag or a purse or a folder for parents who are working with children that have severe mental health needs that it gets really complicated to keep track of. And so that came out of a personal need where I just had binders of information and notebooks where you're tracking medication levels, dosages of things, when an appointment was. The psychiatrist said this, but the occupational therapist said this, and it gets really complicated. Right. And so my then spouse and I put this book together so that way, we could help other families with it. So that was book number 4.
Right.
And then number 5 was LGBTQ inclusion again. But to me, that was actually, and I published that one in 2017. It's called Beyond the Rainbow. And that was the bookend to my consulting career. So that was like, I poured my heart into it. This is the last things I'm ever going to say to you about how to be respectful and nice to other people, bottom line. And I did that. And once I published that book, I was like, all right, now my consulting business is completely gone. Like, I have given everything I can give, and now I can dedicate all of my time and resources to publishing others.
Wow. That's quite the journey.
Yeah.
So
It seems a little zigzag, but it was very, very specific.
I'm curious then, you have the satisfaction, the dream of helping others,
Mhm.
moving on to the blog, helping others, and continuing in your way to continue to help others.
Of course.
Can you talk about a little bit about the personal richness or the personal satisfaction that comes from what you get to do?
I love what I do so much. And there was a number of factors that went into me really kind of going all in on helping people get their books written and published outside of just myself. But I was doing a keynote in the Midwest for a large Fortune company. And I was standing there, and there's, a few thousand people in the audience. It was great. And I love being a keynote speaker. I love speaking. It comes very naturally. And I was standing there on the side waiting to be introduced. And for some reason, I just had this like weird light bulb moment where I thought, all right, I am already, and at that time I had already been working with authors for years. And I was thinking, like, how can I just do it differently? How can I scale it? How can I leverage it? And I was thinking, I'm teaching what I'm teaching in front of, say, 2,000 people right now. But what if I were behind the scenes helping 100 people who are in front of 2,000 people? Or what if I were helping 1,000 people who were in front of 10,000 people? Like, how much bigger could my personal impact on this earth be if I were just the person behind the scenes pushing other people into the spotlight? And
Right.
once I had that kind of connection flip, I was like, well, this is an absolute no-brainer at this point. So, I feel like, I don't want to say philanthropy, but that's also kind of a piece of it. Like, it's in my DNA. Like, I don't know how to operate or work when I'm not passionate about whatever the thing is. So I know that there's a lot of people that are miserable in their jobs and miserable with what they do. And I feel so fortunate that, there's always good and bad days. There's always a day where you're like, could anything else be on fire right now, where you're not thrilled? But it's like, there's just a bigger kind of mission and calling. And I think that there's room for everybody to love what they do and to really impact and inspire people while they're doing it. That I don't know how to intertwine, like unravel those things. They're intrinsically linked. And it's beautiful because I just will continue to do what I want to do. And whoever I energetically align with, like, that's what I'm going to go with. I'm going to follow my gut and just not, take whatever kind of comes my way. And I think too many people get kind of caught in that trap where they think that's the only way. And it actually makes me sad. So I try to, in any opportunity I can, kind of show people that, there's a much bigger thing you could be doing here, and trying to inspire people to do it.
Wow. Very, very motivational thought to leave with. But before we close this off, could you please let my listeners know where they can find out more about you, where they can find out more about Publish Your Purpose Press, all the things?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. So you can go to publishyourpurpose.com. That's where, our press lives, all of our products and programs live. We're on almost all social media platforms under Publish Purpose or Publish Your Purpose. And then I'm everywhere at Jenn T Grace, and that's Jenn with 2 N's.
Awesome. Jenn, thank you so much for spending the time with me today.
Yeah, you're very welcome. I appreciate it.
So this is a really good time for me to have interviewed Jenn and listened to Jenn, because just recently I've been helping lead a workshop for seniors at local library program who are learning to write their memoirs. Now, their memoirs are in many cases, a lot of them are just life story, which is fantastic. So they may not be getting into the raw and emotional, but there's still a lot of things I learned from Jenn that I know I can help these folks with, which is great. I just love seeing people being able to tell their stories. It's such an intrinsic rewarding value when you've helped them with that. But I wanted to talk about a couple things that Jenn talked about. Is the point where when you write something that actually makes you cry, and meaning you've gotten to the heart of it, right? You've gotten the emotion, and that being an important thing. And I'm going to relay this back. So if you don't write memoirs, if you're writing fiction, I'm going to relay it back to something that works for me when I'm writing horror, and I want to evoke fear, or I want to evoke that sort of really strong emotion. There have been times where there have been scenes that I have actually cried when rereading, or in the process of writing them, while I'm putting the words down, tears are pouring down my face. Or I'm writing it and I am scared and I'm feeling the goosebumps and I'm feeling a shiver and I'm afraid to look over my shoulder because of what might be there. When you can feel those things as you're writing, that's a really strong indication that it's coming from a good place. It's coming from a very authentic place. And this is important because Jenn talks about it, the next step in memoir as well as in fiction. And that's where you take that second pass approach. And that's because of, maybe some of the legal ramifications related to true stories or whatever. And that's where you just go with your gut. And it's kind of like, was it Hemingway said, write drunk, edit sober. You just kind of, or Stephen King says, close the door, leave the editor outside and just kind of let it out. And that's really, really critical for solid memoir. And it's also critical for fiction because you want to get that as raw as possible. And then it's the second pass where you're going to do the things where you clean it up, where you maybe change names and identifications so that you protect the innocent or whatever, or you're not going to hurt somebody that if it's a memoir. Or in fiction, it may even be that's the language. That's where you clean it up and you go, okay, I got the raw emotion, but I used repetitive phrases or whatever, and you're going to tidy it up and stuff like that. So that second and third pass are potentially where you clean that up, where you edit that up, or you tidy it up so that it's non-identifiable for real people. And what I love is, if you are a fiction writer and you've never written memoir, I'm positive that you can find some value to get from what Jenn had to say. And obviously, if you're a memoir writer, then this is your cup of tea, right? This can be your kind of episode. But I love how we can, as creative people, we can listen to somebody like Jenn, who is so inspiring and, shares her story and talks about how she helps authors with raw and real and vulnerability and things like that. And I think we can find ways to apply it to our own writing. That's always what I'm looking for as a writer and as a person, is how can I learn from the experiences of others and the things that others are going to be sharing with me. So I hope you found some great value in the conversation with Jenn. I know I did. But that is it for this episode. That is it for this reflection of that interview. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Jenn. I hope you enjoyed the reflection. If you do like this podcast, feel free to please share it with someone that you think would find great value in it, or leave a review on the podcatcher of your choice. Thank you again so much for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. So until next week and next episode, this is Mark Leslie Lefebvre, your host, wishing you great writing and good Stark Reflections.
Thank you for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. You can find show notes for each episode at starkreflections.ca.
The music for this podcast, Laser Groove, was composed and produced by Kevin MacLeod. Check out more of Kevin's great music at incomptech.com.